Where do you go down then? Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Ray Perman, and I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and welcome to this actually second event in our autumn series. The first event was on Monday in Glasgow, a very successful half-day conference with the RSE and with the Strathclyde Institute of Public Policy. On minding Scotland's money, I know a number of you were there. I think that was a very valuable day. This session is unfortunately about Brexit. Brexit's a word that we all wish we'd never heard, but unfortunately it's going to dominate our lives for the next few months and maybe even years. I'm sort of reminded of the great foreign policy question of the late 19th century, the Schleswig-Holstein question, and Lord Palmerston's explanation to the House of Commons that there were only three people who knew the answer to the Schleswig-Holstein question. One was dead, one was mad, the other was himself, and he'd forgotten. And I think that any day now Mrs. May will be up in the Houses of Commons giving the same sort of explanation about what Brexit really means. But tonight we're not going to get an answer to what Brexit means, but we will get, I hope, some very valuable factual information about the sort of things which might influence the discussions over the next few months and years. Three very distinguished speakers. Professor John Curtice from the University of Strathclyde is the foremost expert in the UK on public opinion, and he will tell us how public opinion is likely to influence events as they unfold. Professor Drew Scot is a professor of European Union institutions at the University of Edinburgh and co-director of the Edinburgh Europa Institute. He's also a member of the First Minister's Council of Advisors on Brexit, but is speaking tonight purely in a personal capacity. And Professor Christina Boswell is Professor of Politics at the University of Edinburgh. Some of you will have heard Christina speak in one of the seminars we gave before the referendum, in which she said she'd been studying immigration for 20 years, and for the first 19 and a half of those, no one was listening, but they're certainly listening now, and they certainly will be over the next few months, because immigration is going to be one of the important factors. We're very privileged tonight to have, as the chair of the discussion, Sir John Grant, who was Britain's permanent representative in Brussels from 2003 to 2007, and will be able to bring a sense of perspective to some of the things we hear and to the discussion later on. So without anything more from me, I'm going to hand over to John Curtice.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping this little wonderful device works. Inevitably I'm going to talk about public opinion, and I'm going to leave others to talk about the politics, at least indirectly. For those of you who don't know, I've been involved ever since its inception in the ESRC initiative associated with the EU referendum called the UK into Changing Europe. So much of this comes from that support, and I both have a website that is continuing to follow the story of Scotland's debate about its constitutional future, and also now another site that's continuing to follow the UK's debate about its European or non-European future. Okay, I want to cover three subjects. The first is just to look briefly as to whether there's any reason to believe that voters may have regretted the decision that collectively they made on June the 23rd, or as the economists like to call it, evidence of buyer's remorse. Because clearly if voters have changed their minds, then maybe what they want out of Brexit might be rather different than if they haven't. Secondly, then, to move on rather more directly, what do we know so far from polling data on what voters want from Brexit, and what, according to voters at least, Brexit is meant to mean? That will then take me rather closer to home to the even more complicated subject of what are the implications of Brexit for the prospects in a second independence referendum, which I hopefully will give a tea for Drew to follow up on subsequently. Okay, so let's take each of these in turn. There have been, by my reckoning, 4 attempts since June the 23rd to ask people how they would vote in a referendum. Now, the first 2 are here. Oh, sorry. The first 2 on the left-hand side are a couple of polls that were done right after June the 23rd, which appeared to give some evidence that actually voters had gone, what, you mean to say we've actually voted to leave? Well, we didn't quite mean to do that. But the 2 more recent polls are done by YouGov. They're part of a series of questions that YouGov have actually been asking across a large part of the European Union for about the last 4 years. And basically that suggests that public opinion is still divided pretty much 50-50. And if we can also look at a series of polls that YouGov did during August, where once a week they asked people, well, do you think the decision that the United Kingdom made to leave was right or wrong? And as you can see, that pretty much replicated the result of the referendum. And basically, virtually everybody who voted to leave thinks we made the right decision, and pretty much everybody who voted to remain thinks we made the wrong decision, and relatively few people have changed their minds. So the odds are that so far there isn't much sign of there being buyer's remorse. There is some evidence that those people who didn't vote at all, who of course were disproportionately young, were probably more pro-Remain than the rest of the population, but whether there were enough of them to have actually changed the result if they'd voted is probably still in doubt. So there may be abstainers' regret, but buyer's remorse, that there doesn't seem to be a great deal of consistent evidence. But of course, the other thing we might ask ourselves is, well, okay, but voters voted Remain or Leave on the basis of a certain set of expectations, of which on the one side, the economic implications of Brexit, and on the other side, the immigration consequences of being inside the European Union were undoubtedly the 2 most prominent subjects. So maybe voters have changed their minds on that. And YouGov have very, very nicely and very neatly pretty much asked the same question on these 2 topics that they had been asking before the referendum. So the first 3 readings are the last 3 readings from the last polls for the referendum, and then the 4 readings are again from those 4 polls that were done in August. So the upper line is the proportion of people who think will be worse off as a result of leaving the European Union. The blue line are those who think we're better off. And as you can see, there's been no great shift in public opinion here, though if anything, maybe we're not quite so inclined to think that the world is going to collapse economically tomorrow as a result of the decision to leave. But basically, we're still inclined to the view that we're more likely to think the economic consequences are going to be bad than good, though note it was always true during the referendum that less than half the population thought we would actually be worse off. A lot of Leave voters just basically went, it's going to be all right, it's going to be all right, keep our fingers crossed. Conversely, however, on immigration, where the Leave side clearly had an enormous lead, upper line are the proportion of people who think that immigration would be lower as a result of leaving the European Union. The blue line are those who thought it would increase as a result of leaving the European Union. And as you can see, actually expectations as to the implications for immigration have seemingly become a little more realistic. We're now somewhat less likely to think that immigration will fall as a result of Brexit. And in fact, interestingly, this trend is even sharper on another issue that the Brexit campaign tended to make their own, which was on the implications for the NHS. But even so, you can still see that basically we're looking to Brexit to solve what many people regard as an immigration problem, and we are trying to minimise what many people fear might be the economic consequences. Do people want to go through it all again? No, thank you very much. Once was enough. We please do not necessarily want to have a second referendum. And there is not a great deal of popular support for that idea. So basically, little sign of buyer's resource, maybe a bit of abstainer's regret. Attitudes maybe have become a little less dramatically polarised on the consequences, but we still clearly have a very diverse set of expectations. So, what do we want? Now, just occasionally, opinion polls can be very confusing. And to quote the newspaper headline writer's favourite headline, polls apart. Here is a set of opinion polls which in a variety of different ways have posed what we are told is going to be the principal choice facing the UK in its stance with the EU. Does it want to keep free trade, or does it wish to end freedom of movement? So a number of opinion polls have tried to ask people, so which of these do you think is the more important? Well, on the one hand, comrades from the BBC discovered that 2/3 of us thought that free trade was important and only 1/3 of us thought immigration was important. Conversely, Lord Ashcroft, in a poll he did recently, found over half of us thought that ending freedom of movement was more important, and only a quarter prioritised keeping free trade. Opinion, I've only put up one reading. They've actually come up with a 50-50 split most of the time. Most of these readings are pretty close to 50-50, and yes, you've guessed it, most people who voted to leave prioritise controlling immigration, and most people who voted to remain prioritise free trade. The debate in the referendum is being reflected in the priorities. Why the differences, however, and this there's a long and supposedly learned blog on my UK website about this, but the interesting thing is that quite most of these polls talked about restricting freedom of movement or limiting immigration. Ashcroft asked about controlling immigration. And I think here is a clue. Again, we know that the Leave idea of take back control was an extremely effective strapline. And almost undoubtedly, people want the UK to be able to control immigration, but that doesn't necessarily mean to say they necessarily expect high limits. So it's the crucial thing about who's in charge here, as much as perhaps what is going to be the absolute level of immigration. We can get a bit more detail on this, however, if we, rather than asking people to choose, look, what do you want? Would you regard this outcome as commensurate with Brexit? Now, on the right-hand side, staying in the free market, yep, staying in the single market, that's perfectly commensurate with Brexit, according to the majority of people. Allowing existing EU migrants to stay here, yeah, absolutely. There's lots and lots of polling that confirms that people want to do that. But the two big no's are continued freedom of movement and paying into the EU budget. That 350 million quid hit home. Paying money to Brussels is not very popular, and people want to stop having to do it. This also again emerges out of another set of questions that YouGov did, in which people were asked, well, look, what would be an acceptable price to pay for keeping keeping free trade? Actually, paying money to Brussels was less acceptable than maintaining freedom of movement. So that actually, if anything, is the biggest red line for the public. It's being seen to contribute to the Brussels budget. On the other hand, the EU are telling us whether we can have straight bananas or not. Actually, no, maybe we'll put up with that if we don't have to put up with the rest of it. But of course, what do we want? Well, from the perspective of the Europhiles, could we have our cake and eat it? This is a question which people were asked. Well, look, what should the EU be willing to do? Now, there are a third of people in the UK who are such hard Europhiles that they actually think the European Union should deny Britain free trade unless it signs up to freedom. A third of people in the UK actually believe that view. You might expect people in Germany and France to think that, but the truth is the majority of people say, look, actually, free trade, fine, but only if it doesn't require freedom of movement. And the truth is we're looking for some mixture of the two. And yes, just as to confirm what I said already, Remain and Leave voters just basically have very, very different priorities on these subjects. Okay, that takes me finally closer to home. And the implications of Brexit for IndyRef 2. I'm just going to confine myself to one part of the jigsaw, which is what has been the impact of Brexit on attitudes towards IndyRef 2 and the possibility of independence. And I do so not simply because, well, maybe we'll have a referendum on independence if we think there's a majority in favour of it. But of course, as far as the Scottish Government is concerned, even if in the end it doesn't necessarily wish to hold a second independence referendum, the possibility that it could hold one and might be successful in one is, of course, potentially an important bargaining counter vis-à-vis the Scottish Government as it tries to influence the UK's Article 50 position. Okay, first of all, just to remind us as to where we entered SFI, Scottish Public Opinion is concerned, before June the 23rd. These are all the opinion polls done on how people would vote in India F2 between September 18, 2014 and June the 23rd, 2016. And basically the message is that Scotland remains divided on the subject. The UK is divided down the middle after the referendum on the European Union, and Scotland remains divided around the middle on the independence question. Referendums are pretty bad at settling issues. But on balance, rather more opinion polls tended to have people saying they wanted to stay inside the UK than to leave. And typically, the average opinion poll said 53% for staying in the Union, 47% in favour of independence. So it didn't therefore necessarily need an enormous change in the balance of public opinion before actually we might begin to generate a majority in favour of independence. And indeed, a number of polls which had asked people hypothetically in advance of June the 23rd, how would you vote in India F2 if the UK's voted for Brexit, were finding around 4 or 5% of people saying they would shift from no to yes, which of course would be enough to take us from 53-47 to the other way around. What has actually happened since the referendum and what people have said? Well, first of all, in the immediate wake of the June the 23rd referendum, we had 3 opinion polls, all shown there, which showed small majorities in favour of independence, whereas those same opinion polls, when they had been conducted before the referendum, had all shown small majorities in favour of staying in the Union. Certainly not a swing of the size that the SNP would hope to see, and with the idea you could call an India F2 with confidence, but certainly a swing that will be sufficient to add to what should already be a relatively uncomfortable position if you are desperate to maintain the Union. However, since then we've had 3 more opinion polls, 2 done by YouGov, 1 by TNS, 1 in July, 1 in August, and a couple in August. And as you can see, they actually have all put us back to the status quo ante of around 47% support for independence. TNS actually 12 months ago had 53% in favour. So it looks as though over the longer run, the impact of Brexit seems to be pretty close to zero on the evidence that at least we've had so far, and given that so far the consequences of Brexit are arguably not terribly obvious. Why might be this the case? Well, I think the truth is one needs to appreciate that although Scotland may have voted by 62 to 38 in favour of the European Union, in contrast to most of England and Wales, that doesn't mean to say that Scotland is overwhelmingly Europhile. Actually, attitudes in Scotland towards the European Union are very similar to those in the UK. The modal Scottish voter says, well, I suppose might have to remain in that institution, but it would be nice if it bossed us around a little bit less. It's very, very similar. Why does Scotland vote differently? It votes differently because the issue of Europe vis-à-vis sovereignty is framed completely differently from the way it is in England. In England, being in the European Union is seen as a limitation on the UK's ability to exercise its sovereignty. In Scotland, indeed now long for the Nationalist Committee in Northern Ireland, it's a means by which nationalist aspirations can be realised. So you therefore need to appreciate that the vote in favour of Europe is as much an act of faith in Scotland's role as a nation as it is faith in the European Union. Therefore, perhaps should not be surprised that when YouGov asked people, okay, which would you prefer to be in? Would you prefer to be in a UK that's out of the EU or in an independent Scotland that's in the EU? And you look at the views of those who voted no in September 2014 in particular, yes, there is a small group of them here. There's just under 1 in 5 no voters say, yeah, actually, the EU matters more to me than the Union. But for most people who voted no, the United Kingdom is a stronger pull than is the European Union. And to that extent, at least, therefore, whatever the arguments about the democratic rights or wrongs of where Scotland now finds itself, we perhaps should not be surprised that public opinion has not shifted as much as the SNP might have hoped, although it remains true that public opinion is an awful lot more divided than most unionists would find comfortable. So that takes me finally, therefore. Basically, if you didn't like Brexit, you're probably going to have to put up with it because so far there ain't much sign that the majority of the UK public has changed their mind. There is plenty of room for arguments about what the settlement with the EU should be, But almost undoubtedly, the lesson of the diverse polling is that success will go to he who succeeds in framing whatever options they're trying to advocate in a language that is accept popular opinion. So the advice undoubtedly to the UK government will be is whatever deal you get on immigration, you sell it as Britain now has control, and you don't sell it in terms of limiting freedom of movement, etc. But that said, it's going to be very difficult to overcome the divide that we're facing, because basically Remain voters and Leave voters have very, very different priorities. Scotland, in truth, doesn't so far look as upset about Brexit as the SNP might like, and that potentially raises questions about the Scottish Government's bargaining strength vis-à-vis the UK Government, but we're still pretty divided on the constitutional question. No, it's just there, at the top.
Okay. Okay, so how do I? Is it just,
Oh, you're not on.
yeah, I don't know where I am.
You're not on slideshow is the answer.
Oh, okay.
Are these slides raised set up so that the next one comes on?
It must do, I think.
I'm not a Windows person, so.
Hang on. Just,
Okay, because you need to go to from.
can you set me up? Thank you very much.
No matter, this always happens.
Yeah.
No matter how many hours are spent on preparation.
Okay, that was easy.
So this one?
That's it. Thanks very much. I don't know how that was done. Thanks very much. Yeah, I was asked to talk a little bit about the legal and constitutional options for Scotland and the UK. So what I was going to do is, the issues I want to touch on. What type of Brexit are we looking at, hard or soft, and I want to define those terms. I want to talk a bit about the UK government's bespoke new arrangement, because that's where I think we're heading. How can these negotiations be managed, which I think is a really rather important point that yet hasn't been given them much prominence. I want to talk a bit about the domestic constitutional implications of Brexit, and then I want to talk finally about the options for Scotland, and I take very much John's latter comments. If there's anything you go away with tonight, please understand there is no such thing as free trade. This phrase is being used in an extraordinarily cavalier manner. There is no such thing as free trade. All trade is managed. You can be a member of a market, a single market, where you have access to a regulated market, but there is no such thing as free trade. So the options, and this is how I've defined them, and I think it's how it's now emerging as the definitions we're using in the debate between a hard and soft Brexit. A hard Brexit, it seems, I think we're all now agreed, involves leaving the European single market, no longer being a member of what I've called a regulated market area, the single European market, and instead moving into a managed trade continuum with the European Union. And those of you who want to understand managed trade need to do little more than read the Canadian-EU trade agreement. Now, John's probably negotiated some of these things. There's about 100 pages that you can understand which set out the principles of the agreement. Then there's probably about 1,000 pages that set out the detailed arrangements. This is not free trade. This is extraordinarily complicated managed trade. And I charge you with that this weekend. Sit down and read CETA and see if that's the model that you think can be negotiated in 2 years. And if you think that, then there's a job for you in Whitehall, probably quite a few jobs for you in Whitehall. So my definition of a hard Brexit then is we enter the managed trade arena, where we may have access to the European markets on a case-by-case basis, where we're likely to have no tariff barriers. I totally concede that point. It would be very crazy if we actually started to impose tariff barriers over EU trade with the UK. But of course, the big issue is not tariff barriers, it's non-tariff barriers. It's the rules and regulations governing the production and sale of goods in the European mainland single market. So that would be what I would call a managed trade agreement. It's possible within this managed trade, I guess, to access particular programs if they're negotiated. And being a university employee, of course, we're very concerned with Horizon 2020 and the successor programs and research. And that will have a negative economic impact. I believe that to be the case. A soft Brexit involves continued membership of the single European market, this regulated single European market. But that's got problems. It requires compliance with the four freedoms. It requires compliance with the EU acquis. It requires compliance with a number of flanking policies. And of course, it requires compliance with some kind of budget contribution. One of the great ironies, I think, will suddenly dawn on people when they look at the Norway option is that Norway's present per capita contribution to the EU budget is somewhere about 3/4 of the UK's net contribution per capita, but the UK gets a rebate. If we leave the European Union and join the European Economic Area, which I don't think will happen, then our budget contribution is likely to be more than it is as a member of the European Union. It's one of the ironies of that particular discussion. And of course, outside the European Union, we have complex rules of origin to be policed. That is, that the European Union will only accept into its market products which originate within the free trade partner, and we need at least administrative barriers to make sure that the product which enters the European market from the UK hasn't actually originated, say, in Australia or in America, where they have quite different managed trade relations. So the hard versus soft, in my mind, is hard means it's a managed trade arrangement, soft means we remain within the European single market. I think that's unlikely, as I've already indicated, because it requires us to do things that, as John, I think, has quite ably pointed out, we're not prepared to do. It requires us, there's no other option here, it requires us to continue to observe free movement of persons. It requires us to continue to accept the supremacy of a foreign court, the Court of Justice of the European Union. It will require us to continue with the hated red tape of regulations which people seem to object to when they come from Brussels, but presumably don't realise fully that those same regulations will have to come from London, or if we're in the European Economic Area, they would come from Brussels just the same. And of course, it will continue to require a fiscal transfer, and as John pointed out, perhaps surprisingly to me at least, that was the biggest red line coming out of current opinion polls. And of course, finally, it would raise questions about, do we want to be in the European Customs Union? Which would avoid problems of trade deflection, but that would require us to give up the ambition to have all these extraordinarily speedily negotiated foreign trade agreements, free trade agreements with foreign countries. So I don't see any prospect presently of the UK joining the European Economic Area. I think that is probably dead in the water, and we're then moving on to some kind of bespoke arrangement between the UK and the EU. Now, I think that raises questions. How is this bespoke arrangement going to be negotiated? And I think that's probably the single biggest question that faces the UK government, because from where I'm standing, the economic issues are very important. So the UK will seek to forge a relationship in which the economic dislocation is minimised. That is a rational starting place, which is always a dangerous presumption to make, but that's a rational starting place. The UK government will seek to minimise the economic dislocation caused by leaving the EU single market. And in a sense, the same objective will be shared by our EU partners. They will not want to dislocate their markets. Perhaps the UK firms are involved in a very complex supply chain, or perhaps they enjoy buying UK goods and selling into the UK markets. But of course, the other member states will have different priorities from us. They will need to ensure that whatever deal is struck between the UK and the EU 27 doesn't compromise the integrity of the European Union. So I think that's where we will get into very sharp disagreements over, for example, the free movement of persons. And secondly, of course, the EU 27 will have their own domestic politics to contend with. So, for example, France is being very robust in suggesting that it will not be generous, whatever that means, to the UK when it comes to these negotiations, for fear of giving succour ahead of a French presidential election to the Front National, for example. The same with the Dutch and so on. So I think the domestic politics of Britain are complex, but tractable. The domestic politics of the EU 27 are 27 times more complicated and 27 times more intractable. So that's why I think a bespoke agreement will take a huge amount of time and effort to negotiate this new relationship. And that leads on to something I want to touch on in a minute about transition. So I've been asking myself the question, how would you start? How is the UK going to start this process? What kind of framework will the UK adopt in its fabled letter, the Article 50 trigger? what will the UK say to the European Council? And I think there's probably two things that experience tells us. One dates back to really the Kennedy round of 1962. I wasn't active then. I was alive, but not academically active. I just want to put that one to rest. And I think that the two lessons one of the lessons we get from the Kennedy round is aim high and negotiate derogations. The big breakthrough of the Kennedy round of the GATT agreement, between 1948 and 1962, GATT took forever to negotiate one market access agreement purely on tariffs. Non-tariff barriers were not even touched on. So what they agreed in Kennedy round was say, let's go for a 50% cut in tariffs across the board, and let's negotiate exemptions from that, or exceptions to that. So I think the UK should go for the highest possible deal, and then try and negotiate down from that. Okay, so that, if you like, is setting out a set of political principles or political aspirations which would find its way into this Article 50 trigger, and then say to the European Union, okay, why can't we have this? Let's negotiate away from this. And that, I think, is a more coherent way to do it, because some areas, I think, will be relatively quick to resolve, and some areas could be hugely problematic. So that's on the access discussion. Assuming membership of the single market is off the table, which I'm assuming, the question is, how do we achieve access? Right? Now, that raises a whole bunch of questions on regulations and compliance with regulations, and how much is the UK prepared to accept that it will comply with EU standards across a whole range of markets, particularly, of course, service markets, because in many senses, services don't exist other than as a bundle of regulations. That's what a service is. It's a promise. It's a professional service. And the only way you can guarantee the quality of that is by the regulatory framework surrounding it. So how much of that regulatory framework are we going to allow in our markets, in our statutes, to ensure that British firms have access to the single market? And the question for the EU is, how much equivalence are they prepared to accept? To what extent are they prepared to see as equivalent to their standard-setting authorities our standard-setting authorities? So, for example, in financial services, as we know, we have different regulatory structure in the UK to the Eurozone, but it's accepted as equivalent. Will that continue? And if not, where will the barriers come up, and how can we navigate those? So there's a question on both sides there. How much will we accept their rules? How much will they accept equivalence of our rules as matching their rules? Now, again, I urge you, I really do, go and read the Canada-EU trade agreement, and you'll see how complex this is, because we're talking also about competition law. We're talking about state aid and procurement law. We're talking about areas that are quite close to national economic hearts, and are very close to the reasons, perhaps, why the UK voted for Brexit. So these are big challenges, but I think you've got to go ambitious and negotiate down, rather than have a kind of flat earth. We're going to establish world trade tariffs, and then we're going to negotiate with the EU. I think we've got to do it. And the second thing I think we've got to do is to adopt a reverse enlargement model. The one thing the Commission understands is how to negotiate enlargement. They've been doing it since 1970, when Britain first, or 71, when their application was accepted. Now, the thing about enlargement negotiations are they're structured. And they're structured in areas outside of free trade questions or trade questions. They're structured in areas of policy. So we have the last enlargements involved, I think, 35 chapters, negotiated chapter by chapter, with provisional closure when that was agreed, but nothing was signed until everything had been agreed. Now, that to me seems a logical way to try and unravel the policy side of the European Union membership. And it builds into it this question of transition. Because if we're going to transit out of, say, social policy or regional policy or any of the other EU policies, agricultural policy and all the rest of it, then we need to have a glide path. We can't just come to a complete stop for a whole raft of reasons, not least of which would be complete dislocation to the sector concerned. So I would think that the reverse enlargement model works. At least it's a framework within which to try and negotiate Britain's way out of this. But it will take more than 2 years. It may take 2 years to get the principles agreed and then have the transitional arrangements put into place. But that, to me, seems an obvious way of going about it. In fact, it seems the only way, in my mind, of going about it. Coming to the domestic implications. Okay, so I stood here maybe in February and suggested that Brexit would have an impact on the scope of devolved competences. It was immediately shot down by some SNP politicians, so kind of surprised me. However, it seems to me that the Scottish Parliament, the scope, not the competences themselves, but the scope of devolved competences are bound to expand post-Brexit. The Scotland legislation sets out what is reserved, and everything that's not reserved is devolved. That's the rule. That's the way the evolution works. And of course, agriculture and fisheries were never reserved because they were exclusive competences, more or less, of the European Union. So there was no need to reserve them because they would always be run by Brussels, and the UK government, insofar as it had influence in Brussels, would have exercise that influence over domestic farm and fisheries policy. Now, of course, once we leave the EU, both farming and fishing will repatriate to the UK, and under the legislation, it seems to me it's incontrovertible, they will devolve to the Scottish Parliament. The legislation on fisheries is quite clear. Anything within 200 miles is devolved, because none of it was devolved in effect. It was all run from Brussels. So I think there's going to be very interesting questions for the UK and Scottish governments to decide who controls fisheries, bearing in mind that one of the strong levers the UK will have in any negotiations with the EU will be access to the very rich fishing waters around the UK, particularly, of course, around Scotland. Agricultural policy, again, massive. I think Spice's estimate that 4.2 billion is the cost of the CAP in Scotland over the current financial framework, 2014 to 2020. Well, the fiscal framework we have does not accommodate an increase in spending of 4.6 or 4.2 billion. So there'll have to be some quite fancy footwork in terms of the fiscal framework, and then that raises the question, well, if you want to be more generous per farmer or per hectare than we in England want to be to our farmers, why should we pay for it? So we'll get back into that treadmill, I suspect, of who pays for devolved competences. But that is a significant piece of negotiation within the UK that's going to have to take place. And there's other policies. I would just point out that where EU law is imposed by a regulation, that's got direct effect. There is no secondary law in the UK. It's directly imposed by Brussels. Every time a regulation disappears, somebody's going to have to legislate or just agree that that regulation no longer exists in domestic law. So there's big questions about the hole that will be created through directly effective legislation no longer being directly effective or effective at all when the UK leaves it. And that will again set up this gap which will have to be filled. And of course, the Scottish Parliament will no longer be obliged to adhere to EU laws if it doesn't want to, because it's no longer bound by the treaties. So I think there's big domestic constitutional implications, big policy questions that will have to be asked. Social policy, a lot of very important programmes in Scotland are run out of ESF money. Regional policy's still got a tail. There's a whole bunch of issues about employment law which will have to be resolved, not least, of course, the thorny matter of the Working Time Directive, and so on. So these are big, big questions. Now the options for Scotland. Well, the First Minister set out in July her criteria for what are Scotland's interests, and she pointed to the democratic interest, the point that John made, that more people, 62% I think it was, voted to remain, which is a clear majority in support, so that democratic mandate has to be discharged by the Scottish Government. The economic interest, free movement included in that, single market access and various funding streams, of course. Single market membership, I shouldn't get caught up in my own problem. Social protection questions, the whole issue of employment laws, where there's concerns, of course, by the trade unions, quite vocally expressed this week at their Congress, that absent EU law on these issues and you run the risk of right-wing government simply disinventing many of those protections. I don't know if anybody read Nigel Lawson's piece in the FT a few days ago, where it was now we can complete the Thatcher revolution. In other words, deregulation and competitiveness will become the watchwords. That will be driven by the need to have free trade agreements with our competitor partners out there, and that for many people is a mask for deregulation, both in the company sense, but also deregulation in the labour market sense. Solidarity interest, the logic of collective action at the EU level, global challenges, security challenges, and all the rest of it. And of course, influence, we should shape. So if you look at these as being the First Minister's criteria, then you ask the question, what are the options facing Scotland? And I would actually quite be interested in your views on this. I would take them home and be able to then use them. Obviously, the first way is to exert influence over the UK government. That we know that there's now machinery that the First Minister partly outlined today in front of the European External Relations Committee. That machinery will be used where the Scottish Government will engage through the JMC Europe machinery to try and ensure that London, Westminster, Whitehall listens to the Scottish interest and they're reflected in the negotiating position. I think the First Minister also said today that her preferred second best, or very much a second best, would be EEA membership. So we more or less know where we're coming from. A second approach, which has been suggested by a number of people, is a differential outcome, a differentiated outcome for Scotland. People have talked about the Greenland solution, which I don't think is a starter because Denmark was the member state and then they negotiated a disapplication of European law for Greenland. Well, that would require the UK to remain the member state and the disapplication of European law, England, Wales, perhaps Northern Ireland, and only have European law applied in Scotland. If for no reason other than Mrs May has said Brexit means Brexit, that would seem to be off the table. A close cousin of that was Brendan O'Leary, a politics professor in the University of Pennsylvania, who wrote a long paper called the Dalriada model, which is where he wrote it apparently, saying that we could have fundamental constitutional change in the UK, transfer to Scotland a whole range of powers to allow Scotland to exercise single market membership, assuming the UK remain within the EU. We've even had people discussing now the Flanders option, whereby in Flanders and Belgium, the Flemish government have the ability to conclude international agreements on matters that are devolved to their competence. Now, that would require Scotland getting international legal personality to do something similar. So there's a lot of ideas out there within what you might call this differential outcomes, and I think those are the ones that a number of people are now looking at closely. Particular sectors may be looking at them. For example, financial services may be interested in these kind of options, and these deserve exploration, and certainly on my other hat, I would say that's one of the areas that the Standing Council is looking quite closely at. What are the ideas? And that's why I'd welcome feedback on these ideas. And then, of course, there's the final option, which has to be there, which is the Scotland and Europe Mark II, different constitutional outcomes for the UK and Scotland. I've got really nothing really to add to John's comments on that, but of course, were Scotland to become an independent country, it would have options. It would have options to join the European Union, whether seamlessly or through an Article 49 application. We're back to the indirect one arguments or debate about that. Or, of course, Scotland could join the European Economic Area, if it so wished, as an independent country. So there's, providing, again, as the EU, the members of the European Economic Area agree to that. So the options for Scotland are within these three categories, as far as I can see. Presumably, we could also argue a bottom-up approach that we don't go any further constitutionally. We simply shadow EU policies in those areas we have competence to do it. And justice has been one that's been mentioned quite a lot because we are a separate jurisdiction. Okay, I'm being looked at. Thank you very much.
Because you're so interested.
Absolutely. I don't know what to do.
So could we have a bit of technical assistance? Or is it going to just go straight on?
Oh, here you go.
Oh, great. Perfect. Thank you very much. Seamless transition. Thank you very much. We've already heard that obviously in the public imagination, immigration is emerging as the central issue, or the issue around can we combine single market access with some restriction on free movement is emerging as the big trade-off or big dilemma in negotiations over Brexit. So what I want to do is, as my area of research is EU immigration, I want to zoom out a bit and look at the nature of flows from EU and EEA countries at the moment and what control or restriction might look like for the UK and for Scotland. And then I want to briefly touch on a number of different, at least in principle, options that might be open for some way of combining single market access with some type of restriction on free movement. So I'll briefly touch on that. Right. So, if we look at current trends in EU migration, this kind of graphic has become very, very familiar ever since the 2010 net migration target was introduced by the Conservative Party as an aspiration, as a target. So here we see a kind of a sort of trends in net migration over the last 10 years, and we see that, of course, we've seen record levels of net migration in the past few years, and obviously this is a big headache for the government. Interestingly, Theresa May has recently reconfirmed that the government is still committed to the net migration target. So basically the debate is very much framed around net migration. And within, if we break down levels of net migration, or in this chart, immigration specifically, because net migration is, of course, immigration minus emigration. If we look at the composition of that net migration, we see that EU citizens have become an increasingly relatively significant proportion of net migration or immigration to the UK in this graph. But it's also important to notice that it's still the proportion of EU citizens within total immigration figures is still less than half. So we still have more non-EEA immigrants coming to the UK than we do EEA or EU immigrants. And that even if we subtracted every single EU immigrant who's arriving in the UK, the government would still not be reaching its net migration target. I think that's important to bear in mind. So let's further break down those figures and look at the composition of EU immigration in terms of the different groups of EU member states. So here we see, for example, that the red line at the bottom is EU2, I should quiz you on this, EU2 nationals, which is Romania and Bulgaria, nationals from those two countries who had access to the labour market from January 2014 onwards. So we see there that levels are rising, have been continually rising, but population of those two countries is not enormous. I wouldn't expect those levels to rise significantly from there. I would imagine that they probably are peaking around there and probably will decline. If we then look at the yellow line, that's been the most controversial form of immigration to the UK, and that is the EU8 nationals. So that's the Central East European countries who acceded to the EU in 2008. Interestingly, we think from this type of graphic, it becomes clear that the level of immigration from those countries has probably already peaked, and it's probably in remission now. And I'm going to come to that issue of trends in migration in a minute. More generally, and kind of dynamics of migration flows from particular countries. The one that's increasing and is most significant at the moment is actually nationals from the old or the sort of traditional EU member states, so the EU15, and that's largely accounted for by immigration from southern European countries who are affected by austerity. So that's the one that's been on the rise. Interestingly, there hasn't been systematic research on this, but anecdotally, when we gauge that the composition of these flows is self-selected as relatively high-skilled. So again, we might be quite hard hit if we saw a significant reduction in that immigration flow. Now, if we look at this breakdown according to who already has a job when they arrive in the UK, more than half of EU migrants already have a job, when they at the point of entering the UK, and the vast majority of those who don't already will find one quite swiftly on arrival. Interestingly, again, here to look at EU15, so a much higher proportion of EU15 nationals already have a job on arrival, and this reflects the fact, and I think this is all very important, bear with me, very important to think about this, reflects the fact that migrant networks from those countries are not very well established. So current migrants from southern European countries, for example, although there are existing communities from Greece and Spain and Italy and so on in the UK, it's not been a large-scale recent immigration movement over the last couple of decades. So a high proportion of the people in that represented in that blue line will be high-skilled migrants who are making individual decisions to move with good English language skills, with good prospects on the labour market, probably well educated and so on. And so they are not relying on migrant networks to look for work when they're here. They're making sure they have a job before they arrive. Now, I think, we get very preoccupied with current levels of net migration to the UK, but if we think about the dynamics of migration flows over the longer term, the theory, and this is like a little bit of modelling of dynamics of migration flow here, it's called a kind of migration hump, and it's an inverted U shape, which is kind of beloved of economists, and it suggests that typical dynamics of migration from a particular place of origin to a particular destination tend to take this form, where we start off with pioneer migrants, so a small number of migrants deciding to take the initiative and move. As the numbers become more significant, we get networks emerging, and once networks emerge, it facilitates further migration, so then we get a kind of self-perpetuating effect where more and more migrants move from particular destinations, relying on family, friends, and kin, and so on, to help them to find jobs and integrate into the receiving country. And then over time, there's a kind of saturation effect. So that for a start, the kind of level of a supply of migrants from a particular destination place becomes largely exhausted, and at the same time there's a kind of saturation effect in the place of destination, in the sense that existing job opportunities for that type of labour that's being supplied from that place, again, will decline. So generally, and again, this is a stylised model, we see this kind of migration hump being produced in relation to particular migration flows. And if we just go back, it doesn't look quite that smooth, and it never does. These are always idealised models. But I think we're kind of seeing a migration hump in relation to those EU8 migrants. We've kind of seen a peak, and I think we're seeing a gradual decline now. I think EU15 is probably not yet peaked, and austerity implies that that might run for quite a while, although it probably will be affected by the political situation in the UK and the prospects of Brexit, and particularly if we infer, as I think we can, that migration at the moment is relatively self-selected as high-skilled and is likely to be more sensitive to political dynamics and expectations about Brexit in the receiving country. So all this is really to say current levels of EU immigration are probably not going to be sustained at current levels. If we disaggregate what's going on with the dynamics, they're probably going to decline in any case. Even regardless of Brexit, I think within 10 to 15 years, we would probably see a decline in levels of EU immigration. We would probably see an increase in pressure from non-EU or non-EEA countries. But I think my impression, and I've made this argument before the referendum, is that the problem of EU immigration is probably largely a storm in a teacup. I suspect that those levels will go down more significantly in the context of Brexit conditions at the moment. So what about the situation in Scotland? Well, in Scotland, we actually know less about what's going on, partly because these figures here from the Office of National Statistics are derived from the International Passenger Survey, which is a sample, very small sample. You wouldn't believe how dodgy, in fact, these statistics are. A very small sample of people leaving and arriving in the UK, and the sample disaggregated for Scotland would be so small as to be completely unreliable. So for the Scottish figures, we also rely on labour force survey data, and we don't disaggregate between different sources, different nationalities from overseas coming to Scotland. So we have these rather crude figures of net migration from the rest of the UK to Scotland, and net migration from overseas. So here we see that the level at the moment, or at least the 2014 to 15 figures, suggests that net migration from overseas to Scotland stands at about 10,000. It was more significant, or has been more significant, after 2004, which, as you know, was the sort of a very significant date of the EU8 nationals having access to the labour market in the UK. So that has been hugely significant for Scotland in terms of attracting overseas immigration. Now, you probably will also be familiar with the fact, and I've been asked to talk specifically about the Scotland perspective on this by our chair, you will also be familiar that Scotland, or successive Scottish governments, have adopted a rather different stance towards immigration. They have on occasion talked about targets, but they are upward aspirational targets rather than downward targets. Various politicians have talked about a target of 20,000 in terms of net migration to Scotland, and have wanted to increase levels of migration to Scotland for a number of reasons, including demographic reasons. I won't go into those now. So there are obvious concerns in Scotland about the implications of restricting freedom of movement on immigration to Scotland. So if we look at the composition of immigration to Scotland, so we had that very crude overseas, rest of the UK distinction, doesn't tell us much about how many EU immigrants are in the mix. The best data we have on this, again, is not ideal. It's dating from the 2011 census, which gives you a kind of static picture of the composition of foreign nationals, or foreign-born nationals more specifically, in Scotland. And here we see that the 2011 census revealed that there were 369,000 migrants resident in Scotland, and 7% of the population. So it's not huge compared to the rest of the UK, which has an average of 14% foreign-born nationals in its population. And of that 7%, 43% were EEA nationals, And that was largely accounted for by a significant rise of immigration from the EEA over the previous 10 years. And within these figures, the main EU countries represented are Polish, so there are roughly 55,000 Polish nationals in Scotland, or there were at the time of the 2011 census, followed by Irish and then German. And if we just have a quick look at the types of sectors that EEA migrants are occupied in, employed in, accommodation and food services, significant manufacturing, wholesale and retail trade, and so on. So you can see there's quite a wide spread across different sectors. So you can see how EU immigration has comprised quite a substantial proportion of recent increases in net migration to Scotland, how the government would be keen to sustain or further increase those levels, and how they're spread across quite key sectors in Scotland. So what would the effects of Brexit be on immigration to the UK and to Scotland? Well, here we have to think in terms of scenarios. So I've split this into two scenarios. The first scenario would be we remain in the single market. And we've also seen that it doesn't seem to be politically viable that we could remain in the single market and have freedom of movement of workers as it currently is formulated. So the political consensus seems to be the people have spoken, the people want us to regain control over immigration. So I would assume that if we do remain in the single market, it would have to be contingent on negotiating some sort of cap or emergency stop mechanism to limit, restrict immigration of EEA nationals. Now, the European Commission, the leader of the European Parliament, politicians in Berlin and Paris have all been very keen to emphasise up front that the UK will not be able to cherry pick, that this is not an option on the table, that freedom of the four freedoms, including freedom of movement of workers, are not negotiable. One could also see this as a negotiation stance, of course, and say, well, of course, they would say that at the beginning. When negotiations start, there will be more flexibility. I also think, perhaps optimistically, there are a number of precedents that suggest that this would not be absolutely out of the question to have some sort of cap or emergency stop mechanism. And the precedents are, firstly, within the EEA agreement, there is a stop or a cap possible for up to 7 years on EEA immigration, and it was largely negotiated because of Liechtenstein, because Liechtenstein receives several times its population in EEA immigration. Of course, the UK is not quite, it perceives itself to be similarly swamped by EEA immigrants, but of course it's not anywhere near that situation. But in this case, it's interesting that it's always, the magic number is always 7 years. So it's possible to have a stop or a cap on EU immigration for up to 7 years, justified by serious economic, societal, or environmental difficulties. So that's precedent number one. Precedent number two, of course, was the European Council deal negotiated by Cameron in February 2016, which is now, of course, is completely redundant. But it's just interesting to see how these things can be formulated. So this, of course, wasn't about limiting EEA or EU immigration to the UK, but it was about limiting access to certain types of tax credits, in-work tax credits, this was to the idea was to limit access to these tax credits during the first 4 years of employment, and that restriction, that emergency stop, would apply for up to 7 years, again 7 years, and it would be justified by serious disturbances on the labour market. Now, so I found that very intriguing, that formulation, because on the one hand, the way they defined the criteria for qualifying looked like it was setting a pretty high hurdle, but politically, the widespread consensus was we would deem the UK to meet these criteria. So this is really to say there is a way of formulating some kind of criteria related to disturbance or upset of the labour market, which the UK would, at least politically, by EU member states, be deemed to meet. Now, whether the European Court of Justice would have accepted that is another question, but this is all about sort of precedents and finding previous examples that might be relevant to a future agreement. The third precedent is the transitional moratoria on free movement which are available for member states post-accession. So when new EU member states join the EU, it's possible for existing member states to put transitional arrangements in place which limit immediate access to free movement of workers. And those are initially typically for a period of 5 years, and after that you can add on another 2 years to bring you up to 7, amazingly, years, and that's based on serious disturbances on the labour market or the threat thereof. So if we were being optimistic, I'm not a lawyer, if we were being optimistic, we might imagine that something kind of based around these kind of criteria, this kind of 7-year stop, could be envisaged and could be combined with access to the single market. I want to mention the Swiss example because this is very relevant. They are actively, in panic mode actually at the moment, trying to negotiate some sort of compromise along these lines. So the Swiss, as you're probably aware, voted in a referendum in 2014 to stop mass immigration. They very narrowly voted in favour of this proposition, and that would imply stopping the free movement of workers from EEA countries, and the Swiss plan to put an annual cap on EU immigrants starting in January 2017. Now, the Swiss are not in the EEA. They have their own separate bilateral agreements with the EU, I believe around 120 bilateral agreements with the EU. Drew probably knows this more than anyone. And it's a very complex and mutually sort of dependent set of arrangements with this guillotine clause, so that if they violate one of those bilateral agreements, the whole deal collapses. So a lot is at stake with the Swiss. So if the European Commission deems that this annual cap on EU immigration is not legal within their bilateral agreements, then the whole free trade edifice could collapse. So this is a huge risk for the Swiss, and they're in ongoing negotiations with the Commission about whether there could be some kind of compromise deal on this. There are rumours via certain media outlets that a kind of system of regional or sectoral quotas are being considered, whereby if unemployment is well above the national average in a sector or in a region or in a canton of Switzerland, that it would be justified to impose some sort of cap. But the Commission has vigorously denied that any such deal is on the table. But you then wonder, well, where would these rumours emanate from? This, for the Swiss, this would probably make sense because they have cantonal quotas anyway. So each canton has its own quota for non-EEA nationals, and obviously they have a much more elaborate system for registering foreign nationals, and it probably, it would kind of build on that. So it probably wouldn't be so practically administratively complex as such a deal would be in the UK. Meanwhile, the Swiss have a provision for triggering a new referendum. If you get enough signatories, you can trigger another referendum, and they have got enough signatures, so they will have a second referendum within 3 years, it seems. And so perhaps there's a way of kind of stringing things along until they vote to revoke that 50 point. It wouldn't take much to turn around that result. So perhaps they'll wriggle out of it that way. And perhaps the Commission's hoping that the UK will wriggle out of things in a similar way. So the challenges to this scenario one are obviously, will the EU agree to it? Secondly, would the UK support it even if the EU did agree to it? And I think this goes back to this question of what does control mean. I think if your hard Brexiters in the Conservative Party swung behind trying to sell this kind of deal and framing it in terms of this really does bring us back control, a temporary stop, single market access plus this stop on immigration would imply, regaining control, then perhaps it could garner UK public support. There are a number of practical impediments to implementing it. So if it was a cap, for example, so that after a certain number of EEA nationals had accessed employment in the UK, then there would be some sort of stop. Obviously, you'd need a registration system. There are options for that. But also, how are you going to make sure that the right, or you select people with skills or occupations or qualifications that would match demand in the UK economy? So there might be certain sorts of exemptions, even if there was a cap or a stop for certain skills. I think the issue for Scotland here would be this kind of cap for 7 years would obviously damage Scottish interests in terms of obviously reducing flows to Scotland from EEA nationals. And I think given what I was saying about networks, if you do have that kind of stop in place for 7 years, you're going to sort of cut off or diminish or reduce these sorts of network effects which keep or enable the persistence of migration flows from particular places. So obviously that would be a challenge. Scenario 2 is the hard Brexit, leave the single market. So here I think there are two main options if we leave the single market. So I think the first thing to point out here is that it's interesting that many of the prominent Brexiteers actually didn't talk about aggregate reductions of EU immigration. They talked about being more selective. So, for example, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, they're much more interested in things like they moved to this idea of a points-based system and so on. They're much more interested in saying regaining control is about selecting the EEA nationals that we want to come to the UK rather than just kind of shutting down EEA immigration. So then the issue becomes, if we did regain that control, how would EEA nationals enter the UK? And scenario 1 within this scenario, sorry, I shouldn't talk about that. Scenario 2A, let's say, would be EEA nationals would be subject to immigration control within the existing immigration system. So they would be effectively treated like non-EEA nationals are at the moment. And that would mean that they would be integrated into this multi-tier system, which is the current way that the UK regulates entry into the UK for employment. So, for example, at the moment, this is highly limited. Tier 1, which is highly skilled migrants, is capped at 1,000. Skilled with a job offer, capped at 20,700 and so on. So EEA nationals could be within this tier system. I think it would undoubtedly need to be expanded because I think it would be economically, catastrophic if, in particular, skilled EEA migrants, but also those in lower skilled occupations in sectors which are heavily dependent on foreign labour, if it was basically curtailed or radically reduced. So I think we'd have to see some expansion of this, and that then implies that the goal of achieving the net migration target could potentially be compromised. But anyway, that's option 1. Option 2, under the hard Brexit, leave the single market scenario, would be that there are this sort of preferential treatment for EEA nationals. And here it could get quite technical, but I'll just kind of broadly set out the options. So a lot's been said about the idea of points-based systems. So this is one way of going. So one could have a points-based system where you earn extra credits if you're an EEA national, for example. Also listed, I'd say, in this category because this is part of a human capital-based recruitment system, which means that the recruitment system would select people based on their qualifications and experience rather than based on existing labour shortages. So post-study visa kind of falls into that category as well. The problem with this kind of approach is it's not very efficient in terms of matching people entering to existing labour shortages. And you can have the problem of people coming in with great qualifications, but then de-skilling in terms of the jobs they actually end up doing. So mainly for that reason, it's not always seen as the most efficient, viable model. And I think that's behind Theresa May's recent rejection of a points-based system approach. This points-based system model has also been mooted as an option for a devolved immigration or scope for a more autonomous immigration policy in Scotland. So if we look at the Canadian model, for example, they have a points-based system, but there's scope for regional variation. So, for example, Quebec can have a different weighting of points than the rest of Canada. It can give more preference for people who speak French, for example, and it can it can have a higher quota or generally lower thresholds for the types of points you need to earn in order to attract increased level of immigration, and that's been mooted for Scotland. In fact, Michael Gove wrote a letter to Nicola Sturgeon in the context of the EU referendum debate, saying, "Look, support us because you get your own separate regional points-based system," and Nicola Sturgeon was not particularly impressed. So that's why it's been mooted as a potential model for devolution of Scottish immigration policy, but we've just heard that it's been basically sidelined as an option. The second option would be based on a kind of employer-driven system where employers could, it could be a lower threshold or a lower criteria for employers to demonstrate that they can't fill vacancies if they're offering jobs to EEA nationals. So in other words, this would mean that if you can show that a UK national can't, there are no UK nationals available to fill vacancies, you could then advertise it to EEA nationals before then potentially advertising to non-EEA nationals. So EEA nationals could get preferential treatment. You could also have an occupational shortage list where you define particular sectors or occupations facing shortages, and you could, earmark EEA or prioritise EEA nationals to take up those jobs in those sorts of sectors. So that's another option. Yep, I'm almost done. And you could also have bilateral agreements with particular EEA countries for seasonal or temporary labour. The problems with these sorts of approaches, so the kind of hard Brexit and special provisions for EEA immigration. Well, on the one hand, a selective scheme could be more efficient in matching skills to jobs, but there are a number of problems. It would be more onerous, it would be less flexible than free movement provisions, which allow people to enter and look for jobs and leave and so on as they like. It might put off potential EU immigrants, and if the net migration target is still in place, such arrangements are likely to be particularly generous, and there might be issues around a system which discriminates in favour of EEA nationals over non-EEA nationals. We might deal with the visa issue in the discussion. So just to conclude, in principle, there are a number of options for combining single market access with some form of restriction on free movement, but obviously huge political challenges in terms of EU agreement and in terms of selling it as regaining control to the UK public. I think if free movement is restricted, we would expect some kind of expansion of current provisions for work permits for EEA nationals. In other words, we would want to keep some of them coming into the UK. Even a sort of hardline Brexit Conservative government would want to keep open some options for selective EEA immigration. That might involve some form of special access for EEA nationals. And then I think there are a number of issues around if we do radically restrict options for EEA employment in the UK in the event of Brexit, would there be, correlating with that, a rise in irregular stay in employment? And that might partly depend on how the visa issue was resolved. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Three exceptionally high quality contributions. Thank you very much to our speakers. My job is simply to point at people who'd like to ask questions. There are 2 microphones at the back. Just before we start, and with a view, I hope, to getting the discussion going, to oversimplify grossly these very good presentations, I concluded, first of all, that we are, with the support of public opinion at the moment, headed for what Drew defined as a hard Brexit. In other words, we're not going to stay in the single market. Secondly, that unless the Scottish people suddenly decide to go for independence in a much clearer way than the polls suggest at the moment, that really means some kind of differentiated solution for Scotland within the United Kingdom if the Scottish government's objectives are to be achieved. And I thought Christina could convey beautifully how extraordinarily technically complex just one part of this negotiation is going to be. I have some views on what that means, but that's for another day. If questioners could focus to the extent possible on what Drew asked for, in other words, what does Scotland try to do in this, what I reserve the right to call a mess, that would be great. But you can ask about anything you like. Who'd like to ask the first question? That gentleman there on the edge. Oh, could you say, I'm so sorry, would you mind saying who you are and your affiliation?
Sure.
Thank you.
My name is Bill Roger. I'm in the European Movement for Scotland. European Movement in Scotland. And my question really concerns how this is all going to play out. Drew, you mentioned the idea of aiming high, and it kind of implied a uniformity about it. But I would imagine that at the moment there's some serious lobbying going on from interested sectoral groups. The City of London, for example, and the pressure for the special treatment for financial services staff. And I would think that in terms of Christina's work there, that would walk through in terms of which groups there are going to have some kind of special deal cut for them. How does that then play back in terms of what Scotland needs to do? Obviously has an interest in financial services, but does it then mean that you've got to compete to get your particular interests on the table? Could I add a quick question for John, please? It's just that of the surveys that you mentioned, it's always revealing to know which ones are telephone and which ones are online.
Let me see if there's one more question to add to those two very good questions, and I'll go back to the panel. This gentleman just there.
Richard Curley, the Centre for Scottish Public Policy. Just checking my diary, but a few weeks ago I went to listen to the First Minister speaking down at Dynamic Earth about Scotland's position. The pre-release of her speech clearly used the phrase free movement of labour. I've seen the text that was distributed. When she spoke, she used the words free movement of people. Drew, although Christina's comments are relevant here as well, Drew, when you started, you used the phrase free movement of people, and your slide used the phrase free movement of labour. Is there a chink or daylight or options between those that are significant?
John, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to the very immediate question is most of the data I was showing you were for non-probability internet polls. That's not true of all of it, but it's true of most of what I'm showing you, for good or ill. Let me just speak very slightly to the other part of your question, however. One of the things that we do know about public opinion is that it is relatively relaxed about doctors, university teachers, architects, people professionally qualified coming to the UK, particularly so long as they have got a good command of English. What they're not so keen on are people with relatively low skills, particularly if they may have adherence to religions other than Christianity or nothing at all. So there are some quite sharp variations there, and that certainly insofar as some professions at the moment, including my own, are sucking in quite a lot of non-UK labour, they may find that even under a system that is one of the Heinz 57 varieties that Christina showed us, that probably they may well find a relatively benign climate. I mean, and again, this partly reflects, I mean, you know, the opposition to immigration largely comes from those who are less well off, who with very little in the way of educational attainment, people who feel that Poles or Lithuanians or whoever coming here are actually both culturally challenging and also economically threatening, whereas most university graduates and professions go, oh, it's lovely we have all these people here, please could we have more of them? So insofar as attitudes actually will make it relatively easy to permit the admission of people into those professions which are quite happy to have these people, then if control takes that kind of shape, you can see how we may just simply end up being more selective about who we have in.
Just before going to Drew and Christina, implicit in the point about the First Minister's remarks, I suppose, is the question of how easy it would be to have different regimes in Scotland and the rest of the UK. Could you, Drew, maybe touch on that just briefly?
Well, there are some eminent lawyers in this audience who I'm going to defer to.
I wouldn't do that.
Well, I've always found it's cheaper that way in the beginning.
not in my experience, quite the opposite, actually.
If you don't defer to them when you start, you certainly do after. Never mind. I mean, on that question, the very interesting question is what happens with Ireland. I mean, the Prime Minister has made clear she does not want a hard border between the north of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And now, if she's going to negotiate that, then the question of free movement comes into play big style. How do you then ensure that this open border does not encourage non-Irish EU citizens to flood through it and so on. So there's a big question there that I think Scotland is going to have to watch very carefully, because if they can solve that kind of problem, and I'll defer to Christina in terms of whether I'm actually interpreting this the right way or not, then it opens a space for the kind of differential, perhaps free movement policies you can imagine happen in other countries when it comes to their immigration policy, where sub-state units have some kind of control, autonomous control over immigration. The debate about Labour versus persons, I was using it slackly, I apologise. I mean, there is no such thing as free movement of persons, unrestricted. There are limits on mobility of people if they're not in active employment or seeking active employment. So, in a sense, I'm talking about the free movement of labour rather than the free movement of persons. So I think economically active persons is what we're addressing in this whole debate about immigration. I don't think we're talking about, despite what the press may say, we're not talking about benefit tourists, because that is not legal under the EU rules, and it's quite within a government's remit to exclude those people from social welfare systems and all the rest of it, or to ask them to go home. So I don't think we have unlimited free movement of persons. We have free movement of labour, but within constraints. I don't know if that answers your question, but I wouldn't like to say what the First Minister's meaning on that was. I would also say that from my perspective, we don't start this discussion from the principle of constitutional politics. It goes back to perhaps your point. I don't see this debate about the constitution of the UK. I see this debate about the interests of the country as a whole, and the country, the UK, or the country Scotland. So I think if we start from a place outside constitutional politics, we might end up with a more consensus position of what Scotland needs and the cost to Scotland of particular options which the UK government is going to put on the table. And certainly my discussions with people in various sectors, that's where they're coming from. And indeed my discussion with most politicians, that's where they're coming from as well. What is the Scottish interest here, and how can we best protect the Scottish interest? And I think the First Minister's, the speech I was at as well, sets out fairly clearly where she thinks Scottish interests lie. And I think they're largely in economic and social fields, and that seems to me to be right and proper. I mean, the point about special deals and all the rest of it, I mean, one difficulty we have is we don't know what the UK government wants. So the space that Scotland would find itself in if it wasn't satisfied with the UK deal is absolutely unclear. It is, to me, not conceivable the Prime Minister is going to suddenly say, let's join the European Economic Area. But then again, what is conceivable in politics? Who knows? But it may be the UK government, and I absolutely agree with what Christina said about the weasel words within treaties and Article 112 of the European Economic Agreement and so on. The words exist also in the European treaties, incidentally, the same words. But they have been used in the case of Liechtenstein, but only in the case of Liechtenstein. But the difficulty that they face goes back to something I said about the domestic political environment within which they're working. You talk to a Norwegian politician, they will say the last thing we want is for the UK to get a special deal on the free movement of labour, because that's going to kick off domestic politics in Norway. You know, we don't need that, and the same is true in other parts of the EU when it comes to the free movement of persons. So I think there's a big hill to climb, but I agree with Christina that there's no doubt politicians are able to either avoid these hills or somehow surmount them.
Yeah, I think on this issue, it's interesting, this slippage, semantic slippage between free movement of workers or labour and people. And I would trace it back to the early 2000s and the whole Maastricht EU citizenship agenda, where this kind of very economically based paradigm of free movement was softened to make it more appealing and attractive to EU citizens by talking about people and EU citizens and so on. But actually, it really is a right that applies to those who are employed. It's not a right that's extended to job seekers, for example, or people who are not economically active or self-supporting economically. So actually, this is just a semantic slippage. There's nothing really significant behind that difference. In terms of the business interests and the business lobby, I mean, this is an ongoing debate in immigration policy studies. How influential is the business lobby in shaping immigration policy? And I think the verdict is, when immigration is highly politicised, actually not that influential. Governments are quite happy to trump business interests where it's about winning votes and immigration is salient and highly politicised. Now, how governments typically square that circle or dodge that issue is to obfuscate. So what they typically do is they kind of basically let people in on the sly through complex intra-company transfers or various sorts of bits of legislation which allow people to enter without necessarily being the object of political attention. That's what most continental European countries do. We can't really do that because we have this net migration target and we have ONS figures coming out every 3 months and a huge flurry of media attention. So the government has kind of put itself into a difficult corner on that because it really is being observed. The only form of possible obfuscation is through irregular migration. I don't think anybody thinks that's a particularly appealing solution. But if business has a strong interest in attracting foreign labour and flexible labour and government formally restricts those options, then one way out is through irregular employment of foreign workers, and we've seen that in a number of, especially southern European countries, and doesn't look good. On the last issue on Ireland, I'm not sure that I really get the Ireland issue. Maybe that's just me, but I mean at the moment Ireland has an independent policy in relation to non-EEA nationals, and there isn't a big issue about either asylum seekers or non-EEA nationals crossing the border into the UK. If the UK were to leave the EU and Ireland stays in, it's not within Schengen, so there wouldn't be a common visa zone problem. And if it's a question of EEA nationals having easier access to Ireland and then crossing to the UK, well, unless we're talking about a new visa restriction on EU nationals travelling to the UK, which I don't think is on the table, ESTA is on the table, which is a system for registering that you are going to travel between UK and an EU country. But unless there was a new visa requirement, I don't think that would change anything either. So I'm not quite sure I get what the Ireland border problem is.
Can I try and tell you what? Then you can tell me I'm wrong, because I think it might be of general interest. Isn't it a border control issue? In other words, you're a Polish worker, you fly to Dublin, you go to Northern Ireland, and you make your way into the UK.
But you can't legally be employed in the UK. So, okay, if you're willing to be irregularly employed in the UK, sure, but you could probably do that anyway from France to the UK. So I don't see why it's, you could enter from France, you could cross. So I don't. I mean, because
I think that's what people are.
I know that's the issue, and that was also a debate around the Scottish independence referendum. And there, if you recall, Whitehall and the anti-independence campaign was saying there's going to be a hard border, etc. But again, I mean, it was possible to envisage that there could be an independent Scottish immigration policy and a soft or non-existent border, because very few people will have an interest in relocating if they can't be legally employed in the other country. So I don't. I mean, I think at the margins it might be. But anyway, no. Let me defer. Let me defer to the Irish experts.
Would you like to ask a question? There's a lady down here would apparently like to ask a question.
I'd just like to make a comment, I'm afraid, on this very question that you raised, which is that it is a question of border controls. And when, not even now, but in the 1986 Border Citizenship and Immigration Bill, when the government was trying to basically abolish the common travel area, the question arose in the House of Lords where the bill went first, which was that the only way that both Britain and Ireland can each have an electronic ring fence around each system is by treating British citizens in Northern Ireland on entry to Great Britain as the same as aliens, and they would be checked at ports of entry in Great Britain. And at that time, there was absolute outrage on the sort of liberal free movement front and Northern Irish Unionist peers. When I discussed this question in a seminar in Dublin recently, I was told that that Northern Irish, even Northern Irish Unionists, had become so accustomed to the benefits of a soft border between the north and the south that they might even put up with what they would not put up in 1986, i.e. being checked as though they were aliens on entry to Great Britain.
Well, I think that exchange shows very convincingly why a lot of nonsense may be being talked more broadly about this issue. I'm glad we had it. Who else would like to ask a question or comment? Gentleman in the middle there.
Ronald Watt. Could I ask Professor Scott what happens in theory, or maybe yourself, Chair, in practice, at the end of 2 years after the Article 50 has been triggered, but the negotiations are still stuck on Chapter 1?
We have a problem. No, I mean, I think we've got to, yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, because what the Article 50 says is the negotiations will take 2 years on Brexit. It doesn't mean Brexit has to happen after 2 years. Brexit could be timetabled to happen in the year 25 if they want, you know. But the agreement has to be complete within 2 years. And black letter lawyers will tell you, because they've told me, that means only about Brexit. So the new relationship, which is of more interest perhaps than Brexit, in their view is not part of Article 50, but that is moderately insane, because you need to know where you're going when you're leaving, otherwise you enter a world of chaos. For commercial and economic actors, this would be, and families and all the rest of it, this would be chaotic. So I think that the Article 50 trigger, and I'm not convinced it will happen early in 2017, I think it might happen later in 2017, because I've got no, and John may be better advised than me, but you know, there's no sign to me that London actually has a Article 50 strategy at the moment. So the negotiations 2 years, unless the member states, the other 27, agree unanimously to extend them, they must be completed within 24 months. But that doesn't mean Brexit has to happen within 24 months. So that's why I would suggest that a transition phase out for maybe 5 years, or the kind of 5-year transition phase that people have coming in, countries have coming in, we use that going out. And in that period, we then put in place the new relationship, because one of the complexities of the new relationship is that under EU law, it's almost certainly going to be a mixed agreement. And if it's declared to be a mixed agreement, then it has to be ratified by 27 national parliaments. So there is not a snowball's chance in hell of a new relationship being signed, sealed, and delivered, delivery being the key point, within 2 years, I would say within 5 years. So we have to have a very complex transition arrangement. But I think your question is a very good one, and I would like to hear the British government's answer to that question.
I've got nothing to add to that. Can we go on for a bit? Are we allowed to? So 2 questions, one right in the front, two from the front, and then another one at the gentleman at the back on the edge. Take all those 3 together.
Jeremy Peat, University of Strathclyde now. I'd like to take Drew back to the tantalising points at the end, not Greenland so much as Flanders. My view, reinforced by everything I've heard today, is that there is no good scenario for Scotland emerging out of Brexit, either through remaining as now with the UK as the UK exits, with the hard Brexit alternative, or through independence and joining the EU with all that implies with economic relations with the UK, etc., going forward. So the option of having some means of negotiating a continuing set of relationships with the EU whilst remaining within the UK seems to me the best of the bad lot, and that could include a separate relationship on immigration, as in the past we've been told that may be plausible. So is there genuinely any prospect of maintaining relationships in key sectors as of now for Scotland, and at the same time negotiating a separate migration agreement, so we get the least bad of the worlds that are there as the alternatives?
Yes, that'd be an interesting answer. Gentleman there. Just here in this row.
Hi, Michael Milner, University of Edinburgh Business School student. I've got 2 questions really. Many leavers have suggested that the longer the delay in triggering Article 50 takes, what we're actually going to end up is more of the status quo. Do you think that's really true? And secondly, on that point, do you have any sense from the polls as to what exactly the leavers voted for in terms of a soft or a hard Brexit?
Oh, that's easy to answer, that last one. No, absolutely not. I mean, except in as much as John talked about it, I'm sure. The gentleman at the back.
Thanks, John. My name's Colin Imray. I've just come from the Parliament from a fascinating debate on Scotland's position in Europe, and I've heard the clearest statement I've ever heard from a Conservative spokesperson, who's a professor of constitutional law, on why Britain will not be a member of the European Economic Area, which was 3 reasons, one of which was because of freedom of movement. The second reason was because of the sovereignty of Parliament as opposed to the role of the ECJ. And the third reason was because of the requirement to contribute to the EU budget. I'd welcome your comments.
I tell you what, so I think probably that's the last round, Ray, is it? So I'm going to give each of the speakers a chance, and we'll reverse the order. Christina, why don't you start?
Yeah, so I on the question of whether Scotland could secure an independent arrangement on immigration, I mean, there are models for this. So in principle, yes. I mentioned the points-based system model where you could have different criteria for winning points to enter the Scotland as opposed to the rest of the UK. You could also have a separate occupational shortages list for Scotland. And in fact, in principle, this exists, but it's not really used. So every year, something called the Migration Advisory Committee defines occupations in the UK which are facing acute shortages, and there are lower thresholds for recruiting non-EEA nationals for those sectors, and Scotland can say, well, we have different sectoral shortages, so one can imagine that instrument being utilised. So technically, yes. Politically, less likely, given that the UK is still committed to this aggregate reduction of net migration. So any more migration to Scotland obviously undermines achievement of the net migration target. And then on top of that, there are these issues around retention. So if there's a more liberal immigration policy in Scotland, and after a number of years of residence in Scotland, it would be difficult to stop people from them relocating to the rest of the UK because certain rights kick in, residency rights and so on, then obviously that becomes potential increased migration to the rest of the UK. So I think politically unlikely, but technically possible would be my answer. Thanks.
Drew, lots of things for you.
Well, if Colin came in time, it would help. I had the answer. Differential outcomes. I mean, I think that is the biggest question. I entirely subscribe to what you said. I think that's a challenging question. It's challenging both from the UK side. Is it something that the UK government would champion? That's the first question. Is it something the EU would welcome? Well, if the UK champions it, the EU certainly got to listen to it. So I think the question, my personal view is that there's no insuperable obstacle to that, but I think it would require a lot of goodwill on both sides of the channel, if we can still talk about that. I guess we'll talk about it more. And it will require a lot of very bold thinking by technocrats as to how this could be done. But I personally agree with you. I think that would be the least bad outcome, given where the wind is taking us, it seems, if we look at what's happening in Whitehall, or
Drew,
what's not happening.
Do you mind? Are you assuming that can be done on the basis of the existing Scotland Act, or are you assuming a further UK constitutional change?
Well, it depends how comprehensive you want it to be. I think it would... I mean, already, so for example, in the area of justice, we have a separate legal jurisdiction, we have quite a lot of devolved competences, so there's no reason why Scotland couldn't enter into some agreement on the question of justice where the devolved competences are efficient.
But within the 4 freedoms of the single
No, you would have to see a constitutional change that would facilitate the kind of I use the word independent action. I don't mean independence. I mean, you know what I mean. You would need to see a degree of but I do think the constitutional settlement is up for negotiation anyway. I think it's unavoidable, if only for the fiscal framework, and if only for the CAP and fisheries. So I think it really is up for grabs anyway. But I entirely subscribe, and I think that's where we need some really good thinking from within the sectors. I've not met a sector yet, with one exception, who's looking forward to Brexit, and I think we all know the exception. But that's the only exception now, that I think I've come across who are looking to this as some sort of opportunity rather than huge risk. The issue about Article 50, the longer it's delayed, the less likely. No, I think Britain's heading out. I mean, I think delaying Article 50 is wise, if for no other reason to get a coherent set of asks. We are spectators at a Conservative Party conference, all of us, in my view. And until the Conservative Party sorts out what it wants, I'm afraid the rest of the country is on hold. And personally, I find that a hell of a way to run a country, but that is the way we're running the country. We are on hold until the Conservative Party works out how to... I had a wee quiz unwisely with a very eminent political scientist. I said, when was the last time the country became before party? And he gave me a long screed about it. But, you know, that's the question. When do we trigger Article 50? Well, when we have something to say. And I think we're woefully short of that just now. And the point Colin made, yeah, absolutely. I did make the point in discussion that these are the red lines. The sovereignty one is the particularly annoying one because I heard Liam Fox before the referendum give a very impassioned speech about sovereignty in which he was referring only to constitutional sovereignty in some abstract sense. He wasn't talking about effective sovereignty. It is almost certainly the case that Britain will be a less sovereign nation, at least over economic laws, after it leaves the EU than it is at present. That is unavoidable, in my view. Because we are a small trading nation who will be told, here's the rules, whether it's WTO rules, whether it's the EU rules, we will be less sovereign as a result of that. And I would argue that to the cows come home if I had the time.
Thank you. Sean. I think probably rather than trying to respond to the recent question, let me just leave you with a slightly interesting thought. The truth is, of course, is that the United Kingdom has never been much more than a semi-detached member of the European Union. And indeed, occasionally when foreign correspondents would come and talk to me before the referendum, I did say, are you quite sure you want us to vote yes? I mean, we're not exactly necessarily going to be easy members if we continue to be members. But in any event, of course, what that underlines, of course, is that so far at least, for the past 40 years, the European Union have decided to put up with this and have given us all sorts of exceptions and opt-outs, etc. So in a sense, the fascinating question now is, with us deciding to leave, how much does the European Union still wish to give us opt-outs and exceptions and etc.? And that raises the interesting question as to where the European Union sees its interest lying so far as the future relationship with the UK is concerned. And it's probably on that the ease or otherwise with which the UK will manage to get out of the European Union will probably turn.
I'm really glad you asked that question because I wanted to answer it. I think that's exactly the right question. You have to look at this from the point of view of what you might deem to be the collective interests of the European Union, and that's not to give the United Kingdom a good deal, because the existential threat to the future of the European Union is very great from anti-EU forces within the EU, and the better deal we get, and this unfortunately hurts Scotland too, the easier it will be for others in the EU to argue there is an option outside which is better than being inside. So we won't get a good deal. So it will be a very hard negotiation. It will be a technically overwhelmingly difficult negotiation. It will take a long time, and by the end of it, we'll all be heartily sick of it. Thank you, three brilliant speakers, and thank you to the audience.
And on that cheery note that we'll all be sick of it very soon from Sir John, can I thank him for chairing the discussion and the speakers again. Invite you to take a drink with us outside. You'll need one after that discussion. And remind you that our next event on October the 10th is really special because we have Sir Angus Dayton, Nobel Prize-winning economist, come to speak to us about global prosperity and inequality from the Enlightenment to, unfortunately, Brexit and worse, Donald Trump. Thank you very much.